There is nothing wrong with your radio.
Do not attempt to adjust the volume.
We are controlling the broadcast.
For the next hour we will control all that you hear.
You are about to experience the knowledge and insights of the Media Mothership.
All right, we're here live as always on Thursdays in Edge Radio doing Media Mothership, broadcasting out of Edge Radio Studios in Nipaluna, Hobart, Tasmania. On this show, we explore how media can shape our understanding of the world around us and all manner of other oddities and weirdness. Today, we've got a special deep dive with a guest that's on the line talking about his recent experiences in Japan, as well as his insights into some of the music he caught up with there and his own passion in wrestling. That's Trent Breward. Trent, are you on the line now?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Thank you very much for having me, and a good afternoon to all of the listeners on Edge Radio. Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Yes, I'm just amazed that the technology works. We're also streaming on YouTube and Twitch, so you can message in on the YouTube or Twitch channel, or you can SMS us live in the studio at 04888811. 707. So without any further ado, Trent, you've just recently come back from Japan. How does that trip stack up with other experiences and expectations you've had of Japan in the past?
I've been very lucky this was not my first trip to Japan. It's not my second trip to Japan. I've been able to go a few times now and experience different aspects. Whether it's going to different parts of Japan, going up north. This trip I went up to Tohoku. I've been to central Japan, going more to the west into areas like Hiroshima, going nearly to Kyushu. I haven't quite done that yet, but I like mixing things up and going into areas I haven't been and then exploring deeper into Tokyo and the different things it offers. And including stuff like that is kind of what we're talking about today, is stuff like the music culture, like the pro wrestling scene, because as great as it is seeing the world around you and going into like the different temples and seeing the nature of it all, there's really nothing like Tokyo for just immersing yourself into the various different subcultures that Japan has to offer.
That's right. And I guess a bit of full disclosure, I was happy to have been a teacher of yours at the University of Tasmania here in the journalism, media and communications program we had. And I'd taken you, Trent, twice to Japan on the New Colombo Plan grant. And we'd done a number of trips as part of exploring ideas of soft power and Japan. And I think it was the second trip where we tried to get tickets for wrestling. We went into a convenience store and tried to find a way of getting it, and unfortunately they were all sold out. This time, the trip you took, it went a bit better. You were able to get some tickets to wrestling.
Yeah, look, it's a combination of just going and being a more understanding of what is required when trying to get tickets, because unfortunately, as popular as Japanese wrestling is getting in the West, I mean, it is still a niche topic, but it is becoming more popular with wrestling fans in the West. It's still not conducive to buying tickets for the average fan. If you want to go, it's not easy to just say, I want to go online and buy a ticket. Because unfortunately, a lot of wrestling companies and the systems they use to buy the tickets, they require you to have a Japanese phone number. So unless you're willing to, set up your own phone number, have a Japanese address, or if you, happen to know someone who lives in Japan and can buy it for you, you're kind of stuck to either do what we did, go into a convenience store, try and speak Japanese and hope that the show isn't so popular that it sells out, or kind of, depending on the show, you might be able to just, message the company if they're small enough and get them to hold a ticket for you. But the most common way in this day and age is to go through a third-party source. There's a few different groups out there. I don't necessarily want to plug them. I'm not sure what the right way to do it on this kind of service is. But, there is a group that I use which have been pretty reliable. They don't charge too much extra, and they'll ship you the tickets right to the hotel that you're going to. takes a lot of pressure off your back. You can just go to whichever show that you want to go to, and there's a lot to pick from.
Right. So, what types of wrestling did you see while you were over there on this trip then?
So I went to a few different types. I went from one of the most famous venues, not just for wrestling, but just venues in general in Japan, is Ryogoku Sumo Hall, which, as the name would suggest, is primarily used for hosting the biggest sumo events in Japan. It's where pretty much all of the major sumo matches that are hosted in Tokyo, which every 2 months, pretty much every 4 months, in Tokyo specifically, is held at this venue. There's a major event there which featured one of the biggest Japanese wrestlers, which is currently wrestling in America. She came back for a special kind of homecoming show and appeared in a promotion called Marigold. They had their biggest show of the year in Ryogoku Sumo Hall, had about 3,500 people at the show. And it goes from a venue as big as that down to this little show which is held in an old dentist office where they don't even use a wrestling ring because they literally can't fit it in the building. So they just wrestle on a chocolate mat, and it's called Chocolate Square because of the color of the mat, in a promotion called Choco Pro. It's very DIY, do-it-yourself kind of punk aesthetic, mixed with the kind of bubblegum pop styling that you would expect from the Japanese kawaii culture. And that kind of fusion is so at odds with like what a lot of people would picture from wrestling, but it just works so well. You're right. There's no ropes. You are the ring ropes. You kind of can fun experience. You know, whenever I go to Japan, I typically go to about 3 or 4 different shows, and it's fun to get that mix from the big, big stadium shows to the little tiny, 20 people crammed into a building because. If you had 21 in there, it's a fire hazard.
No, thank you. I mean, Zoom is turning your voice into a bit of a robot. I'm hoping you're still on the line, Trent. Is the connection still working? A little bit.
I can still hear you.
Yes. Sorry.
Can you still hear me?
Yeah. No, just the Zoom connection's going a little bit digital, but
Yep.
You're back now. Fascinated to hear about the spectrum of wrestling gigs from the chocolate mats performance to the big wrestling thing. So who was the wrestler, the Japanese wrestler that was back
Choco Pro?
Choco Bro, and then who was the big name WWF wrestler that was back? The Japanese wrestler. Who was she?
Is a WWE wrestler called Io Sky, who made her name in Japan under the name Io Shirai. And she basically came back, even though the promotion she was wrestling with this time is new, a lot of the people that she'd kind of made her name with in Japan is currently operating with this new promotion. And so the match that she had was with someone that she'd had a long and storied tag team with, had several match of the year candidates with back in the mid 2010s. And it was their first time wrestling in 7.5 years. So it was a big kind of homecoming celebration for her, big party kind of atmosphere. And then they went about, trying to systematically hurt each other for the spectacle and entertainment of everyone in attendance.
So for those fans here that know wrestling, there'd be a type of energy that you'd see in the audience on Netflix when you were watching WWE. What's the energy like watching Japanese live wrestling there? Does the audience behave differently? I know in music there's more choreographed audience behavior. What's the audience behavior like in Japan in the wrestling gigs you went to?
It is a very different atmosphere to the typical Western wrestling culture. There's probably 2 main things you'll notice if you go to a Japanese show compared to, say, an American or a British wrestling show. The first one is in the West, it's more common to do chants. So you might be doing you might hear the audience chanting, "This is awesome," or "This is wrestling," or chanting specific names. You don't get that as much in Japanese wrestling. They're more likely to just make general kind of cheering or booing noises. and then you'll have individual fans cheering out for a wrestler that they like, and the wrestler might turn and kind of acknowledge and generally the general direction of that person to make them feel acknowledged and special, but typically they won't engage in the chanting aspects that is more commonly associated with the West. And the other thing you'll notice if you go to a Japanese show is probably every third person in attendance is a professional photographer, and they've spent the money to have the equipment to have professional photography equipment. They've got the big chunky SLR cameras, they've got the telephoto lens, and it's a big deal over there. Like they've got thousands of dollars of equipment invested in these cameras, and they're taking these incredibly high quality photos. And you're sitting there next to them with your little camera phone, just trying to take souvenir snaps. And if you are with the online fan culture for Japanese wrestling, you will see these high grade professional quality photos, which have been taken from halfway across the arena. And the photos that they post look like they're right in front of the wrestlers. It's fascinating and incredible to see kind of the dichotomy between what you would expect the fan to just be there and maybe having a camera phone versus, looking like they're being paid professionals.
And how about the merchandising? I mean, in the audience, do people buy like wrestler fans or something that they're doing, or light sticks, or is there a different level of merchandising that you're engaging with at the Japanese end?
It definitely depends on the promotion. There are some promotions, especially say the Joshi or the women's wrestling, if they lean more towards the idol culture, they might engage with like the light sticks. There's a lot of merchandise, and especially smaller promotions rely very heavily. They might not be able to pay as much money as the bigger promotions to the wrestlers, but the wrestlers make their money back on merchandise. And for example, the show I went to at Ryogoku Hall, of the, say, 3,500 people that were there, I reckon a good 60% of them were probably in line trying to buy merchandise when the doors opened. And then of those 60%, probably another 30% were then there after the show trying to get photos with the wrestlers and autographs. And it is big business over there. It's run a little bit differently to the West. They may not have the super professional setups, and at, say, smaller shows, it's not uncommon to see the wrestlers themselves selling their own merchandise because they just can't afford to be paying professionals to be running the stalls. And that in of itself presents you an opportunity as a fan to engage with the wrestlers that you like. You buy pieces of their merchandise, you thank them for the performance, they thank you for being a fan, and for a little bit extra, you might be able to take a photo with them while you're buying that merchandise. But it is sort of, that's not too dissimilar from the Western independent wrestling setup. But especially when you combine it with certain idol tendencies that certain promotions utilize, you do see certain differences really highlight themselves.
Because it was something I'd only seen in the music scene, I guess, in Japan on trips we'd taken, where after the smaller gigs, you had the opportunity to do, I think it's referred to as the handshake event or something. You go and you join the queue for the artist, the performer that you enjoyed the music, and then you get a handshake with them. And obviously, if you brought some merchandise, you could. Was that similar with wrestling? Is that like after the event, there's an opportunity to meet the wrestler, as you were saying?
Yeah, there's definitely sort of meet and greet opportunities with wrestlers. Again, it depends on the size of the promotion. Bigger promotions maybe will have one or two wrestlers allocated per show, which run meet and greets. They might have separate events outside of the shows themselves. And then you'll have wrestlers which will kind of run their own meet and greet opportunities, especially if they're independent and not sort of connected to individual promotions. They might be doing an event at a bar where it's like, I will be serving drinks at a bar. You can come to the bar and get the opportunity to interact with me, which kind of combines with the fact that some wrestlers kind of have side jobs, which can include working at or running a bar. There's several wrestler-owned and run bars around Tokyo, which then lean in. The wrestlers come in and do special shifts at those bars, and it's kind of a self-fulfilling kind of gig economy within this larger wrestling economy.
Did you have much of an experience in that engagement yourself while you were over there?
I've been to a couple of those kind of places. There's a very famous wrestler that works for New Japan Pro Wrestling, which is the biggest promotion in Japan, called Toriyano, and he runs his own kind of. It's kind of a bar restaurant-y kind of vibe. It's bigger than your typical izakaya restaurant, but it's similar kind of food. And that's run not too far from some of the biggest venues in Japan. I didn't go this time, but a couple of years ago I went there and he was operating the bar, and he'd come over and chat with you. And it's just kind of casual kind of setting. It feels very different to what you would expect from the typical fan wrestler engagement setting, because like he's just come over and casually chatting with you, as opposed to you're in line, you buy merchandise, you thank them, you take a photo kind of set situation. It's an unusual experience, but yeah.
How's the language barrier?
Tough. There are some wrestlers which have decent Japanese, especially those who might travel to America. Because of the growing popularity of Japanese wrestling in America, there have been a lot of promotions in America, the independent promotions, which have been bringing in Japanese wrestlers to do tours. And because of that, Japanese wrestlers have been improving their English, as well as those who kind of recognize, if I have good English and I utilize that on social media and YouTube and stuff, that just naturally increases your fan base internationally. Some of them not so good, but they recognize the opportunity. Like if you leave a good impression on a fan, whether they're being genuinely nice or just recognizing this is a better chance for me to improve my standing, make more money, they're always going to try and do their best to look after you, especially if you go up to them and are polite and understanding.
So how do you find the experience as a Westerner engaging in wrestling, particularly over the years you've been doing it? Has that experience changed much? Were there less Westerners when you first got into it, more now as it developed into something bigger?
It really exploded probably since about 2018. There's been a series of explosive growths when it comes to Japanese wrestling in the Western scene. It started with the promotion I mentioned earlier, New Japan Pro Wrestling. A couple of wrestlers got really big in the Western scene. A lot of them now are in American promotions because the Japanese yen was just too weak. American companies saw the value in bringing them in. And then sort of around the COVID period, there's a couple of women's wrestling promotions, because in Japan, instead of being co-gendered promotions, they tend to be split into men's and women's promotions. There was one or two women's promotions in Japan that really exploded in popularity. And it went from being everyone would watch the men's wrestling in Japan to these women's promotions really becoming super popular. And that's why wrestlers like Io Sky, as I mentioned, are really popular now. And a lot of the Japanese women's wrestlers are starting to get targeted by these American promotions. And so, having been in the sort of online discourse in Japanese wrestling since about 2015, it's been steady growth, followed by a couple of really peak periods, which has exploded the popularity, exponentially, I would say.
Is the Japanese style of wrestling different from the Western style? Do people talk about the Japanese style presenting a different type of flow or move or relationship with the type of wrestling moves? What are those?
Very much so. There's a couple of reasons for that. Just looking at the way Japanese wrestling is presented in general, because in America, a lot of the big promotions live or die on being on weekly television. So how they show their wrestling and produce it is based around guaranteed weekly television, whereas the Japanese model relies on touring. So you assume that not everyone's going to be watching every single show that a promotion puts out in Japan. So storylines and feuds and rivalries progress differently in Japan than they do in the West, where they assume every Monday night at 8 o'clock you're watching these 2 hours. So in America, there's a lot more talking in English, whereas in Japan, they're not going to be in the ring for 20 minutes talking about their life story, which as a Westerner who doesn't speak Japanese, that's quite helpful. But as a result, a lot of the storytelling and stuff happens in social media, in interviews, which you then have to hunt down. It's not necessarily presented in an easy 2-hour segment on national television. And the wrestling style itself is typically harder. It tends to be stiffer. It tends to be seen as quote unquote more realistic. A lot of the America, like WWE, which is the easiest one to use as an example, because most of your listeners, if they know wrestling, probably use WWE as their example. That is seen as more theatrical and safer on the body. They realize, like, if our wrestlers are doing this too seriously, it's a bit dangerous for them. So they try and protect the bodies a bit more. The Japanese wrestlers kind of wear marks on their chest as a badge of honor. That shows that they've been in a fight, they've been in a war. So the purists, which I guess I'm a part of, can look down on the American style a bit. And can reminisce of the Japanese wrestlers that have gone to America and look back on the good old days. But it just depends on what kind of wrestling you prefer. And even within the Japanese scene, there's a massive variety. You get the real sort of sports presentation, the hard-hitting style, and then another promotion will have a giant 10-foot inflatable panda wrestling and a sex doll as part of their act. It is all very different kind of stuff.
So did I hear that correctly? The purists?
Puro. So it's short for puroresu, or pro wrestling in sort of Japanese.
Right. Puroresu. I was surprised. I came across a fascinating fact. Way back in the day, Hulk Hogan had his early career in Japan as a wrestler. So the Japanese...
Yes, he put in a bit of a stint in Japan, and he had a different finisher. He didn't use the leg drop. He used a clothesline, using the arm, which he called the axe bomber. And a lot of people look at the matches he wrestled over there and were kind of like, oh, why isn't he wrestling as hard in America than he did here? Because the expectation in Japan is you have to wrestle a certain style. You can't wrestle the same way in America as you do in Japan and expect the same reactions.
So the Japanese wrestling scene goes back a long way. It's one of those... do you know dates of when the wrestling scene in Japan emerged? Was it a post-war American influence kind of thing?
Yeah, it's definitely influenced kind of around the post-war. A lot of wrestlers, even though they speak Japanese, the moves are called or said in the ring using English terminology. So instead of using like a Japanese word, they will say lariat, a clothesline kind of move. They'll use powerbomb, suplex, because they're just taking the English words from it. And the biggest early wrestling superstar in Japan was Riki Dozan in the 50s and 60s, who was originally Korean, but they sort of presented him as the national hero. Then you had Inoki in the 70s and 80s, and it all kind of grew in from there.
Yeah, right. Of course, yeah, you've had a number of, like even the sumo wrestler moved into pro wrestling in America. Well, I forget his name now, but that was big in the 90s. Onizuka?
Yeah, there was a Yokozuna who was Hawaiian, but presented himself as a Japanese sumo wrestler because why not?
And he had a second career after sumo wrestling in the American pro wrestling environment.
Yes, but that was the story presented, yeah.
And pro wrestling in Japan is very much a Western influence, is seen as having its origin in the West. Because I guess in Japan, of course, you've got sumo wrestling, but much like baseball, I guess, equally Japan has a huge baseball, soccer sports environment. Pro wrestling kind of slots in nicely there. But it does have a really established history, doesn't it? And what about the gendered audience? Is it mainly male audiences in the wrestling events you went to, or split male and female, or?
Very much depends on the shows you're going to. So if you're going to, and depends on the promotions as well. So if you go to a men's wrestling promotion, so New Japan, Pro Wrestling Noah, it can be pretty split, 50-50, which can surprise a lot of people who expect it to be very heavily male-dominated. There are some promotions like Dragon Gate, which leans more into, say, more handsome men wrestling, which can be predominantly female fan bases.
Right.
When it comes to the women's wrestling promotions, that does tend to skew more in the men's side, but that's more of a recent trend, because when you look at the late 80s and early 90s, when wrestlers like the Crush Girls were wrestling, when women's wrestling was the biggest it ever was in Japan, and there's actually a Netflix documentary, a Netflix show called Queen of Villains, which kind of covered this period. that was predominantly young women who were watching that product and were seeing these wrestlers as aspirational. It's just as that kind of scene hit a bit of a downswing, they realized we can guarantee a certain market by presenting attractive young women. What's the primary demographic for people who want to see attractive young women? Men. They'll pay money to see that. But that demographic is starting to ease up a little bit, and as they draw more women back in, but that area is still more dominated by men.
Fascinating, isn't it? That so this was the Netflix series. What was it? Queen of Villains?
Queen of Villains, yes.
Yes. My wife, who's Japanese, knew that series. And this was in the 80s, right? This was one of these huge... I had no idea that there was this vibrant, engaged female wrestling scene that was watched by young girls and women in Japan, and it was huge entertainment. So
it was a massive thing.
And as you're saying, that
they were able to wrestle in the Tokyo Dome, which women's wrestling hasn't been able to get back to.
Really? So that was really the high point of women's wrestling, where it was.
Yeah, 1994 when they got there, the big egg.
Wow, fascinating. So again, we're on the Zoom call here with wrestling fan Trent Breward. He's just returned back from a trip to Japan, and he's letting us know what the Japanese wrestling scene's like, the pro wrestling scene there's like. So we've got, I don't know, maybe a few more minutes left before Zoom crashes on a free plan that we're using. Were there any standout matches that you saw? Were there any kind of events you saw that just really blew you away? Given you've been a couple of times now and you know the industry, were there still things that surprised you on this recent trip?
Yeah, so I mean, the main match that I was drawn to for going over there was the match where Io Sky was coming to Japan for the 7.5 years since she last wrestled a wrestler called Mayu Iwatani, who, from a personal standpoint, is my all-time favorite wrestler. So seeing that story get told again, they were the two that got me into Japanese women's wrestling and their storied history. So seeing them in the ring after 7.5 years was incredibly special, and they managed to live up to the expectations that I had, and a lot of other people having talked to them since. That whole show was absolutely spectacular. Fit the billing of a Ryogoku Sumo Hall. And then, there's an event which was called Kin Gacha at Shinkiba First Ring, where, as based on the name, everything was gacha. It was a mystery. You didn't know what to expect when you were going to the show. And that event was just a whole load of fun. There was a tag team, which I'm a really big fan of, called Spark Rush, who got to wrestle. And because it was gacha, I didn't know if I was going to get to see either of them wrestle. And I got to see both of them team up together and basically kick the crap out of two young rookies who are both very high prospects and, put up a good fight. So it was a lot of fun. The show, all the shows I went to delivered, but they were kind of the two matches that will sort of stick out the most for me on what was a fantastic trip overall.
Well, Trent, thanks so much for taking us into this huge deep dive into wrestling. We haven't even got around to the music space, so we'll have to bring you back in a future week to go into the live music scene, which I know you've, from experience, when I took the students over there, had an amazing, I think you're the only person I've ever seen in a Japanese music event that did some stage diving into the crowd. So well done.
And of all the people, it was me.
Huge foreigner. But no, thanks.
That wasn't planned. They spoke to me in Japanese. I didn't realize what they were saying.
No, the vibe was good. The vibe was positive, because it could have been one of those kind of ugly foreigner moments, but it was very much a cool thing. And it was captured on YouTube. And I think they were just amazed that a group of Westerners were in this Shinjuku loft, Wednesday night gig, enjoying it. So again,
that was the venue. Yeah.
We'll have
it was a very special show.
Yeah, we'll have to get you back in to talk about the state of the music scene that you enjoyed on the recent trip. But amazing to hear some of that wrestling information. We'll see if we can get some links to put into the show notes as well later after the show, Trent. Great. And any final words? Any final thoughts? If you're interested in wrestling, why should people put Japan on their go-to list for wrestling?
basically, there's three great countries for wrestling: America, Mexico, and Japan. Of Japan, Tokyo is where everything happens. There's basically pro wrestling every single night, and is one of the true homes of pro wrestling. It's developed its own unique style, and no matter what kind of wrestling you want to see, it's going to be there somewhere in Japan. Despite the language barrier, super accessible, super fun, and
Well, there we go. And indeed, sadly, the sad YouTube connections died out, but we've made great use there of the Zoom connection. Thanks again, Trent, for being involved. And again, as is mentioned, if you're heading to Japan and you've never thought about it in the past, try out going to a live pro wrestling gig in Japan. As he was saying, there's three big countries for pro wrestling: the US, Mexico, with it, and Japan. So if you're enjoying the pro wrestling that you've been seeing on Netflix, maybe next time you're in Japan, check out the pro wrestling there and enjoy that. We'll go to a quick Media Mothership intro and then come back with a deep dive into some interesting media oddities and information. So keep listening here to Media Mothership. We'll be back in a second.
Around Hobart City and in the territory out west, there's just one way to handle the media and the spoilers, and that's with a radio host and the sound of Media Mothership.
Media Mothership, the story of media power that spread globally with Young Australia, the story of a DJ theorist who moved with it. Craig Norris, PhD.
Duffy's Tavern, where the elite meet to eat. Duffy ain't here, but Archie is, and he's got a special treat for you tonight. He's hosting Media Mothership, the show that brings you the latest news and views from the world of entertainment. And now, here he is, the man who knows everything about showbiz, Archie.
Welcome to Duffy's Tavern, where the beer is cold and the talk is hot. I'm your host, Archie, the man with the plan and the brain with the strain. We've got a show for you tonight that'll knock your socks off and make your head spin like a top. So sit tight and loosen your belt, because we're about to serve up some verbal vittles that'll leave you licking your lips and scratching your head.
All right, we'll fade that down. All right, we're all reset up now after doing our live Zoom talk there to Trent Breward about his recent trip to Japan and experience with the Japanese wrestling scene. Fascinating stuff there. We'll post up some further information about that on show notes. You can see that on the podcast information after the show's all finished. Right now, I want to pick up where we left off last week with our deep dive into the 1960s classic Japanese anime series Gigantor. I'm sure there are a lot of Gigantor fans out there from the great old days when it aired in Australia as well as the US. Pretty much one of the first Japanese anime series that made its way to the West. At the time, many people didn't know it was from Japan because of the dubbing. And what we're listening to today is the really interesting dive into that from Fred Ladd, who was the chief dubber extraordinaire who was involved in taking the original Japanese version and dubbing it into English. And what we're going to listen to here are some of the comments he has about, in the 1960s, the early Japanese animation industry and Americanizing it for an American audience. Here we have listened to him talking about how the voice actors often did impersonations of, at that time, well-known American radio personalities. I mean, if you're looking to localize your foreign cartoon, what better way is there than reference and imitate famous American commentators? So let's listen here to Fred Ladd talking about dubbing the Gigantor Japanese animation series for America in the 1960s.
Doing men's work, but now I handle things myself. Spider speaking. Announce to the world that Spider will release Ameritas in exchange for Super Elects.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen, there's bad news.
Now, this is an impersonation of a commentator popular at the time, a man named Gabriel Heater. Gabriel Heater would come on the air saying, there's good news tonight. So here we have Gilbert Mack doing an impersonation of Gabriel Heater delivering the news.
Don't see what there is to argue about.
So again, I think that's a really interesting point there, that in terms of localizing US or localizing Japanese anime into the US culture in the 1960s, it's not just translating it. In fact, they pretty much had, throughout the script from the original Japanese version, it was a genuine American reinterpretation. So putting in and inserting US media culture specifically into the animation that wasn't in the original Japanese. So there you had a news broadcaster that would have zero relevance to today's audience, Gabriel Heater, but was then a famous American radio commentator doing an impersonation of that voice, so that the local audience would listen to it and go, oh yeah, well, obviously this is American culture, even though it's from Japan. Next little clip I want to play is really going to the heart of some of the moral dynamics within the Americanization of Gigantor. The idea of the American child hero and the way in which Fred Ladd decided, how can we have this child hero talk to adults for a children's cartoon and not disrespect adults? Again, 1960s, we're looking at Leave It to Beaver, you know, these kind of classic whole meal, I guess, American apple pie TV culture period of time. So let's hear how, again, they try to insert that moral coding of child and adult behavior in the Gigantor dub.
But they simply can't back out. Dr. Emeritus' life could depend upon it.
That's a bluff.
Inspector, you never know. Spider's a dangerous man. I'm in favor of giving him the invention.
Now, look, I know we have to save a life, but Jim, what do you think Spider would do?
Now, you see, here we have a classic situation of the young boy, the 12-year-old boy, in effect lecturing the adult authority, Inspector Blooper. Now, Blooper takes it kindly, and Jimmy often refers to Uncle Bob. Uncle Bob was, in fact, Bob Brilliant is not, in fact, the uncle of Jimmy Sparks. It's an honorary title. Bob Brilliant was the associate of Jimmy's father, who helped to invent the robot Gigantor. Always with respect, Jimmy always talks with respect to Bob Brilliant and Inspector Blooper, even though Jimmy may have a different idea about what is the moral thing to do, what is the right thing to do. He might vary with the adults, but always respectfully, and always took their advice as seriously as he could.
So Ladd there is raising a really interesting point where he's describing how the main character in Gigantor, Jimmy Sparks, you know, the 10-year-old, 12-year-old kid that has the remote control that powers Gigantor. Of course, if you've ever seen Gigantor, it's the story of a young child who comes in possession of a remote control of a giant robot called Gigantor, which is used to thwart all manner of crimes and hijinks in a kind of typical 1960s way. But it's basically a wish fulfillment fantasy of a young kid and the power fantasy of controlling a giant robot. So what Fred Ladd, the American adapter Gigantor's describing here is how Jimmy Sparks is often in many scenes lecturing the adult authorities, the police, and so forth. But importantly, Ladd says, in terms of their scripting, they had to do it respectively. I mean, you could wonder whether or not that's a code regulation in terms of ensuring that they were still within the requirements of creating content aimed at children in America in the 1960s. Certainly, I think, reflects that, stereotype of American storytelling conventions in that period where, child protagonists had to still be seen as morally pure, maybe correct, but certainly not your Stranger Things type early teen characters. You have a character here more like a kind of boy hero that aligns with the type of ideal U.S. family TV norms of the early 60s, which is respectful to authority, aspirational in terms of he has access to this huge power, but it is a different cultural depiction of authority that they're figuring out here in terms of from the original Japanese to the American, making sure that character was going to be portrayed in a kind of respectful way to characters. And we can also see that following up. I mean, Fred Lake goes on to talk about how, while there are moments where Jimmy Spark defies adults, that's always within a context, which he goes on to explain here.
Sparks is, he might vary with the adults, but always respectfully and always took their advice as seriously as he could.
And that night, at Bob Brilliant's house...
This is Spider speaking, Dr. Brilliant. Hope you're watching.
We're going to see a case here in a moment where Jimmy Sparks is not only going to take issue with the adults, but is going to go his own way, seemingly in contradiction of the adult voice. Now here goes Jim. He feels he's got to do what a boy has got to do. He's going to quietly open the safe. There's the Super Alex. Now here comes Buttons Brilliant. He's going to discover the apparent theft. And this creates a moral dilemma for the boys and for the adults.
Break in.
This isn't the work of a gang. It's Jimmy Sparks.
What? Oh, you don't mean you really believe the lad committed an act like that?
Yes, I'm sure. Jimmy did it. He thinks that Spider will keep his word to exchange the doctor for Super Elex.
Right. I'd better follow him.
And that's all we have. We don't have any condemnation of Jimmy. We don't have any moralizing. They just pick up on the action and go from there. Moral dilemma momentarily solved.
So what's interesting there, again, Ladd's talking about a moment where in the plot, they've decided that Jimmy is going to steal the invention and try and negotiate with the villain in defiance of the adults. So while in the previous scene he'd been talking about the importance of their version of Jimmy Sparks from the Japanese original, instead of being part of a Japanese cultural environment of childhood, putting him into an American cultural climate of the 1960s where they're portraying a kind of identity aligning with US family TV norms, where he's respectful of authority. Nevertheless, it's interesting ideologically from a US perspective, they can shift gears and say, but here we've got Jimmy defying adults, but again, it is in a US kind of myth of a boy's got to do what a boy's got to do. That kind of, I guess if you were to put it into a cultural cliche, diving into that Western or American stereotype of the rugged individualist, the kind of, with a kid, in this case, Jimmy Sparks, 12-year-old, even for him, he knows what needs to be done and will go and do it. It'll be an interesting question to compare that with the Japanese original to see how that issue of obedience and hierarchy, which we've just seen in the American version, where Jimmy Spark is obedient and respectful of his elders, the hierarchy, can be in the American version. but then also can tone shift into this rugged individualist trope, as we're hearing here, as a kind of interesting cultural reinterpretation, maybe, of children's heroism that's going on here. So to bring it back to what Fred Ladd's saying, we'll dip back into the episode as Jimmy is stealing that invention and negotiating with the villain.
They're coming. That means they want to exchange super elects for the doctor, but I'm not going to give him...
You'll also notice that Jimmy Sparks himself is piloting the boat, and he's got the super elects with him. Again, now in contradiction of the recommendation of Dr. Bob Brilliant and Inspector Blooper. He's going his own way.
So, Jimmy Sparks, you are a spunky young man. Did you bring super relax?
Spider, you astonish me. I always thought you were supposed to be a pretty smart customer, yet you select for a rendezvous the deepest part of the ocean.
Yeah, so what?
So if I drop the super elect here, even your submarine won't be able to recover it.
Hey, what do you think you're doing, you crazy kid?
Spider, better send the doctor over here.
Pass the super...
So we see now Jimmy is also a tough negotiator.
I mean it. Either you hand over Dr. America...
But he can afford to talk tough. He's got the remote control box that controls the world's biggest and mightiest robot. The one, the only, Gigantor.
So again, there we're seeing the climactic scene in episode 4 of Gigantor that Fred Ladd's unpacking as representing this kind of rugged individualist child hero narrative that he's inserting into the scene where, even though, you know, Jimmy Sparks is a child in the 1960s and has to conform to US family television norms of what a child should be doing, nevertheless, it's a cartoon, and there are aspirational tropes like the rugged individualist, which they can also dive into and have Jimmy be able to defy the adults, negotiate with the villain, and win the day. Changing tone slightly, later on, Fred Ladd talks about the interesting cases where they've had to rework the animation. So, in particular, the robot's face, the Gigantor robot face, and how animators add expressions not present in the original. So let's listen to how Fred Ladd talks about the kind of animation from the Gigantor series and the emotions that they were feeling from an American perspective. The Gigantor animated face, the robot face, was conveying to them.
A determined look on Gigantor's face here. That was a liberty taken by the animators. Normally, Gigantor's expression never changed, but the animators would, to show determination, often just create a little frown line and put it in, innocuously, so that it didn't show much, but you knew that the robot was determined.
So again, that idea of ultimately when you're localizing animation from Japan into America in the 60s, you're stuck with whatever the animation was often. And we've talked about in last week's episode how they would recontextualize Japanese writing into simply being computer language as a way to explain why all this kanji appears in the scene. So sometimes they'll do it diegetically within the storytelling and try to say, wow, you know, we're in a computer space, so this is computer language. For those audiences in America that had no exposure to Japanese language. Alternatively, though, as Fred Ladd has talked about previously, we'll listen to him discuss it again, there are moments where they'll request new endings from the Japanese animation studio that will fit the US release order that they're stuck with within syndication. So we'll hear how Fred Ladd's talking about the particular US syndication market in the 60s put different requirements on this long-form storytelling that was happening in Gigantor in Japan, where one episode leads into the other episode and the story continues, whereas the US was not built around that model for its syndicated television. As we'll listen here. Hold on, let me just cue it up.
Now we know we're getting near the end of the episode because we have the triumphant music. Not only is the heavy action over, but the music will always tip off that we're near the end of the episode. Now, here we also had to be careful because there's another episode coming up with the character of Captain Spider. So we had to make sure that the ending, as it was produced in Japan, met our needs of being able to extend it into another episode, even if it meant shooting a new ending for this episode. And as I recall, that is what we did here.
If you think a few little drops of water can keep the spider down, you've got rocks in the head.
So that's pretty huge revelation there in that commentary track from Fred Ladd in the 1963 Gigantor episode 4, where he's saying that early U.S. animation early U.S. localizations of Japanese anime, like Gigantor, would sometimes completely alter the narrative structure and then require that new endings be filmed so that the series could play out of order. In the US, stations weren't required to play episodes from 1 till whenever in order. It could be mixed up. It could be a mess. And this is, of course, in the 1960s, so we're talking about non-serialized, non-continuity, standalone episodes. So they had to then make sure that if the end of an episode, as we just heard there, was setting something up, they would just have to require it to be redrawn so that there was a natural narrative closure there. So again, an odd bit that shows the depth of modification that Gigantor went through, way beyond dialogue, way beyond just dubbing the anime. It was actually shooting new endings for some of the episodes to conform to the non-serialized structure of US television entertainment in the 60s for children's television. Anyway, fascinating deep dive there. That's today's show. Again, thanks Trent Breward for being involved in the first half of the show, taking us into a deep dive into Japanese wrestling. Again, we'll post some notes up there if you're interested in that for your own trip to Japan in the future. This has been me, Craig, for Media Mothership on Edge Radio for another week. Show notes, again, including hopefully some of those links, will be available on the YouTube and Twitch for the show, as well as on the podcaster provider of your choice. You can listen to previous episodes of Media Mothership on YouTube, Twitch, and at edgeradio.org.au, or your podcast provider of choice. We'll be doing a bit of field research next week, so no Media Mothership next week, but we will be back the week after. As 2025 is coming to an end, we'll be doing some really fascinating recaps of the exciting media that's been going around this year. Until that episode, stay curious about media, do some work, find out more about Japanese wrestling, watch some old 1960s episodes of Gigantor, and hopefully you're enjoying the nice December weather here in Hobart or wherever you're listening. Right now, we'll listen to some wonderful Edge tunes and keep listening to some great music.